The first time I watched Fire and Ice, I was sitting right next to the visionary who brought it to life, my grandfather, Frank Frazetta. It was 1994, and just like Grandpa, I was already completely in love with movies. Looking back, it must have been a gross, muggy day outside because he almost always preferred spending his days outdoor, especially in the summer, but not that afternoon. Instead, we stayed inside his studio, and he told me that he wanted to show me a movie that he had made. At that age, that was probably the most exciting thing I could have ever imagined him saying, because in my mind, movies came from a faraway place like Hollywood, the big league. The idea that my grandpa had actually made a movie felt completely surreal. I remember climbing onto his cheetah print couch and immediately eyeballing the candy bowl that was sitting on his coffee table, but it was usually filled with the gross candies, the black licorice and those awful little pastel candies covered in tiny beads, which I now realize were another form of licorice, Grandpa's favorite. Every now and then, if I was lucky, there would be Swedish fish or peach rings hiding among them, but I can't remember if there were any that day. What I do remember is the smell of coffee. His third pot of Folgers was brewing while he finished the last cup of his second pot, accompanied by a subtle smell of oil paint mixed with the earthy linseed oil. He grabbed the VHS from his armoire, where he kept all of his photographs and important documents, walked over to the VHS player and gave it a quick blow to knock the dust off, and it began. The first thing that captivated me about Fire and Ice was the music. Even now, when I think about Fire and Ice or revisit it for the 1000th time, William Kraft's score plays in my head. And at 5 years old, I couldn't have explained why it affected me so much. But I guess it doesn't need to be explained, though, because when art hits, it hits. And years later, I learned that my grandpa felt exactly the same way. He was thrilled with Kraft's work, and he was the one who insisted that the film needed a large-scale orchestral score. In hindsight, that makes sense because he listened to classical music when he painted. I remember watching Fire and Ice like every other movie I watched with him. Neither of us could sit through the entire film quietly. We were too excited. We pointed things out and commented on scenes that we really loved or little details that were extra special, like the backgrounds drawn by Tim Callahan and painted by James Gurney and Thomas Kincaid. And while I don't remember every detail of the conversation 30 plus years later, I do vividly recall the feeling of sitting there beside him on the couch while this world of Fire and Ice unfolded across his big 90s TV screen. At that time, of course, I didn't understand what it meant to make a movie. I just knew that my grandpa sitting right there beside me had helped create the world that I was seeing on the screen. And I remember every now and then glancing over at him and then back at the television, almost as if I was checking, like, is this true? How could I be so lucky to have a grandpa who made a movie? A few years later, after rewatching Fire and Ice many times, I learned there was another person responsible for the world, Ralph Bakshi.
As a director, I wanted to work with the best artists in the world. As a director, you should work with the best people in the world. You know what I'm saying? And so I went to work with what I consider the best artists. And that was Frazetta.
I knew Ralph, but at least I knew him the way children know adults. I don't remember exactly how old I was when I met him, 7 or 8, details are fuzzy. But what isn't fuzzy is my memory of Ralph. I always knew when Ralph was around. My grandpa's studio sat on the opposite side of the house, and I always heard him before I saw him. I'd walk through the front door and I'd hear this booming Brooklyn voice. And then I'd usually find him and Grandpa together in the studio while my grandma would be up in the kitchen making peppers and eggs or hiding up in her room chain smoking. And when those two were together, they were usually goofing off or laughing about something or lightheartedly arguing about something, which often looked very similar. As a kid, I remember thinking it was really funny that these two seemingly big kids made a movie together. And for most of my life, that's how I thought about Fire and Ice. It was Grandpa, it was Ralph, and it was the movie they made together. Then years went by, I grew up, my grandparents passed away, and I stepped into the family business, which would slowly change the way I perceived everything about my grandpa. Over the years, he has been reintroduced to me as Frank Frazetta, and the making of Fire and Ice was also part of that discovery. A looming question I've had in the back of my mind for some years now as I piece together the history is, how did it all come about? Did Ralph just pick up the phone? Did he just drive out to PA and make Frank an offer he couldn't refuse? They seemed like they'd known each other forever, and maybe that was it. As it turns out, they had. Not long ago, while working on a Fire and Ice project that will be announced at a later date, I had the opportunity to reconnect with Ralph through his wonderful daughter, Victoria. And one of the things that came out of those conversations was a remarkably heartfelt reflection on Frank. Fire and Ice, and their friendship. What struck me wasn't what Ralph wrote about the movie, it was what he wrote about my grandpa. The first sentence answered the question I'd been carrying around for years. Frank Frazetta was my friend. According to Ralph, they were simply two Brooklyn boys who grew up playing stickball, and the way he described it made me laugh because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. Competitive, athletic, convinced he could beat anyone at just about anything, but Ralph insisted he was the only person who ever beat Frank at stickball. Frank apparently never admitted it, and that checks out. Fire and Ice grew out of a friendship, out of a mutual respect, out of two artists who understood each other long before either became famous. Ralph also said that when he eventually made it to California, one of the people he most wanted to bring with him was Frank. He wanted him to get out of Pennsylvania for a while, to have some fun, and to make a movie, to finally get paid properly for his talent. An interesting note is that Ralph wasn't the first filmmaker who wanted Frank Frazetta involved in a movie. By the time Fire and Ice came along in the 80s, Hollywood had been circling him for years. Directors and producers and studios all recognized what made his work special, and they understood that his paintings possessed something many fantasy films struggled to capture. Among those interested was John Milius, who wanted Frank to fly out to Spain to work on Conan the Barbarian. Dino De Laurentiis had also pursued him for many years, and opportunities came and went, offers were made, yet my grandpa never committed to any of them. Because at that point of his life, my grandpa wasn't interested in becoming an art director for someone else's vision. He had already spent decades building worlds of his own, so what Ralph offered him was different. He wasn't asking him to help visualize somebody else's movie, he was asking him to help create one based on his many artworks. According to Ralph, there wasn't a major creative decision made on Fire and Ice that he didn't discuss with my grandpa first. He was there as his partner. For perhaps the first time, filmmaking offered something that felt familiar to him, which was ownership and creative control. And so, after years of opportunities that came and went, and so nothing ever materialized, Fire and Ice finally brought Frank Frazetta into movies. Unfortunately, it also coincided with one of the most difficult times of his entire life. During post-production, my grandpa became seriously ill. At first, nobody understood what was happening, doctors struggled to find answers, and it dragged on for years. Ralph later recalled how frightening that period was and how, for a time, they feared that he might never fully recover. What nobody knew then was that would become the beginning of a long and very frustrating battle with an autoimmune disease that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet somehow, in the middle of all of that uncertainty, Fire and Ice continued moving forward. But sadly, because of his health issues, it was the first and final film, which makes it even more sacred. Before we go into post-production, let's go back to the beginning. After Frank and Ralph inked the deal, before the actual production even started, the Frazetta family packed up their lives in Pennsylvania and temporarily relocated to Valencia, California, where Ralph rented a house for them. Whenever I talk to my mom, Holly, about that period, one thing becomes immediately clear: my grandpa loved it. When my grandparents moved to Pennsylvania in the 1970s, my grandpa was 40 years old, and his creative world became remarkably solitary. A painting began with him sitting in front of a blank board and ended with him sitting in front of a finished one. His work happened in the quiet hours of the night while classical music hummed from his record player, or in the days between baseball games on television, cups of coffee, and long stretches alone in his studio. His time in California was the opposite. It was all about collaboration, and suddenly he was surrounded by actors and animators, stunt performers, and technicians. It was like kind of being back in his glory days in Brooklyn with the Flegel Gang, a time that he felt fully alive. My mom said that he couldn't get enough of being on set. He loved the energy of the production and the constant exchange of ideas. But my grandma, Ellie, however, had a very different experience of California. While Grandpa was living it up, my grandma found herself increasingly homesick for Pennsylvania. And I'm sure that tension weighed heavily on both of them at times. California really impacted my grandpa, and I remember talking to him about his time there. And I remember him saying that it got away from him and he shouldn't have listened to my grandma and he should have moved there because it was the best place in the world. My mom and I were recently talking about this, and she confirmed it. She said that after he filmed Fire and Ice, he drove up to Carmel, and that's where he ultimately wanted to be. But unfortunately, that never happened. Over the years of my research, I've had the opportunity to speak with many of the creatives who worked on Fire and Ice, and almost all of them described the same thing. It was an adventure, and for some, it was the time of their lives. There was a sense of something unusual happening, and it wasn't because anyone knew that the film would become a cult classic 40 years later. It was quite the opposite. Most of them were simply trying to make the best movie they could with the resources they had, which were definitely limited. but they were doing it alongside Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta, two larger-than-life personalities whose enthusiasm for the project was impossible to ignore. And this is where we break. Join me next week for part 2 for more behind-the-scenes stories about Fire and Ice. Thank you so much for watching.
Why do the living disturb the sleep of the dead?
I follow his trail. I seek a girl, Tigra.
A girl. Yes, she did this to me. She and Necron. Cursed Necron.
Where can I find her?
Why should I answer?
For revenge against Necron.
Necron? Agatha! They take her to Agatha! And from there to the Icy King's realm. Avenge me. Avenge!